Thank you and welcome, everybody. So glad you could be with us today. We are going to spend the next few hours looking at fraud in clinical research, which is not exactly a fun topic in a lot of ways. Certainly these things happen. We don't always like to think of it in terms of them happening, but they do. And we will talk about some of the more recent cases that we have seen. We will also look, of course, at some of the information about findings and really where our focus lies. Now, we haven't really ever come up with an effective way of preventing fraud, unfortunately, but our focus really is on deterrence. So what we're going to focus on really are how we minimize the systems that really leave us in a position where we have that fraud culture, if you will, or those elements that are actually going to be more conducive for fraud taking place. So we're going to look at significant and current examples of fraud in clinical research, as we mentioned. We're going to look at the current focus of regulatory and congressional bodies and their findings in terms of why there's been such a focus on this over the last few years. We'll talk about the sponsor, CRO, IRB, clinical investigator, and study staff role in detection and deterrence, really, rather than prevention of fraud. We're going to look at the impact and consequences of fraud in clinical research, and it goes far beyond just data integrity. It also certainly links us to issues with subjects' rights, safety, and welfare. And what it comes back to truly is looking at public health. What we're ultimately trying to do is make sure that we have public health and the public's faith in what we are doing so that we can actually feed into the public health system, providing new products, new and approved products that are safe and effective for folks to use for their care. So within that, we'll look at the impact and consequences of fraud in clinical research. And as we discussed, landmark and recent cases of fraud in clinical research. And we'll also talk about some of the best practices that we're seeing out there in terms of controlling that environment for fraud. So we'll look at the definition and elements, an overview of fraud. We don't usually use the term fraud per se. We talk about misconduct, and we separate that from noncompliance. And we do so because it seems a little less harsh. We can have noncompliance where we forget to do something, but it doesn't necessarily imply that it's a repeat or deliberate expectation of noncompliance or that we are deliberately trying not to do the right thing. So noncompliance is defined as the failure or refusal to comply, to conform or adapt one's actions to a regulation or requirement. And it, of course, implies that we are not behaving according to the standards or the regulations that govern the conduct of human subject research. From a legal standpoint, fraud is an intentional perversion of truth for the purpose of inducing another, in reliance upon it, to part with some valuable thing or to surrender a legal right. It is a false representation of a matter of fact. So when we think about fraud in the context of clinical research, we know that if we are an investigator, if we're a sponsor, if we're an IRB, however we fall into our role in clinical research, we are working with others. Others are in reliance upon us. So for a clinical investigator site, you have the expectation from the IRB that you're going to be in compliance with the protocol that it reviewed and approved and that you're going to follow those policies and procedures. And the same holds true for the sponsor. When you think of something as a right, it is something that is due someone by law. So when you peel it back and look at the regulatory requirements that we all have in our roles in clinical research, you actually have an obligation to follow the protocol, but the IRB and the sponsor have a right to have an investigator who is functioning within the confines of that protocol and what's been reviewed and approved and all the training and those sort of things. So when we think of it that way, we are reliant upon one another. We know that there is a lot of redundancy and overlap in the regulations that govern human subject research, and we need to be mindful of those, both for our own procedures as well as what those expectations are. Misconduct in science or scientific misconduct is usually used to replace scientific fraud because fraud is a legal definition and it requires evidence of intentional deception and injury or damage to victims. Now, these are all reasonable assumptions when we are falsifying data, that we have specifically intentionally falsifying data or deleting data, a reasonable exception that we have injured or damaged someone. But usually we err more on the side of misconduct or scientific misconduct. Therefore, we see most of our SOPs and those sort of things written to include that terminology rather than fraud.